d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop g7, knight f3, c5, bishop e3, queen a5, queen d2, castle kingside, rook c1, bishop g4, d5, b5, bishop takes c5, rook c8, bishop b4, queen b6, bishop e2, e6, castle kingside, knight a6, bishop e7, knight c5, queen f4, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, e takes d5, e takes d5, rook e8, d6, bishop f8, rook b1, bishop takes e7, d takes e7, a6, bishop c4, knight e6, a4, queen c5, bishop takes e6, f takes e6, a takes b5, a takes b5, rook fe1, rook a3, queen f6, queen takes e7, queen e5, rook c8, rook takes b5, rook a takes c3, h3, rook c1, rook b1, rook takes b1, rook takes b1, rook f8, rook b6, queen f6, queen e3, queen a1 check, king h2, queen f6, king g3, rook e8, rook c6, rook e7, f3, king g7, king h2, queen f5, rook c4, rook f7, rook e4, queen f6, h4, e5, h5, g takes h5, rook takes e5, queen f4 check, queen takes f4, rook takes f4, King G3. Rook A4. Rook takes H5. King G6. Rook H4. Rook A5. Rook G4 check. King F6. King H4. Rook B5. Rook A4. H6. Rook A6 check. King G7. Rook E6. Rook B2. King H3. Rook B4. Rook A6. Rook C4. Rook B6. Rook A4. Rook C6. Rook B4. Rook D6. Rook A4. Rook D3. King G6. Rook E3. King G5. Rook E5 check. King F6. Rook E3. King G5. Rook E6. Rook H4 check. King G3. Rook A4. Rook B6. Rook A3. Rook B5 check. King G6. King G4. Rook A2. King H3. Rook A3. Rook D5. Rook B3. Rook D8. Rook A3. Rook G8 check. King F7. Rook G4. King F6. King H4. Rook A5. Rook C4. Rook A2. Rook F4 check. King G6. Rook G4 check. King H7. King G3. Rook A3. King H2. Rook B3. Rook A4. King G6. Rook A6 check. King G5. King H3. Rook C3. Rook A8. King G6. Rook A5. Rook C4. G3. Rook B4. Rook A6 check. King G7. Rook E6. Rook A4. Rook E4. Rook A5. King G4. Rook G5 check. King H4. Rook A5. F4. Rook A1. Rook E5. Rook B1. Rook A5. Rook C1. King H5. Rook H1 check. King G4. Rook G1. King F3. King G6. G4. Rook F1 check. King G3. Rook G1 check. King H3. Rook F1. Rook A6 check. King G7. Rook A4. King G6. Rook A6 check. King G7. Rook A7 check. King F6. Rook A4. King G6. King G2. Rook B1. Rook A6 check. King G7. King G3. Rook G1 check. King F3. Rook E1. F5. Rook F1 check. King E4. Rook E1 check. King D5. Rook D1 check. King E6. Rook E1 check. King D7. Rook E4. Rook E6. Rook A4. Rook G6 check. King F7. King C7. Rook F4. King D6. H5. King E5. Rook takes G4.